Okay, take two, and welcome to the quadruple D. And in early August 2025, more than 50 Texas House Democrats fled the state, some to Illinois, New York, or Massachusetts, to deny the GOP controlled lower chamber the two-thirds quorum needed to conduct business. That departure effectively paused the special session called by Governor Greg Abbott, which was set to run through August 19th and included debate over a new congressional map backed by President Cheeto Face Donald Trump. Under Texas House rules, at least 100 of 150 members must be present to vote. Republicans hold 88 seats, Democrats hold 62. By leaving, Democrats made business impossible in the chamber. Democratic caucus chair Jean Wu framed the decision as morally clear resistance to a corrupt political deal meant to dilute Black and Latino voting power. So Abbott responded with a sharp warning. He demanded that the missing legislators return by 3 p.m. on Monday, August 4th, 2025. If they failed, he said he would seek removal from office under a non binding 2021 Attorney General opinion by Paxton, which suggested but didn't conclude that abandoning a session could qualify as forfeiture of office. I said office by accident. Anyway, Abbott and GOP leaders also authorized civil arrest warrants and $500 daily fines for absent members, though those apply only within Texas. Deploying the Texas Department of Public Safety and even Texas Rangers, they attempted to locate in state lawmakers. Those who are out of state remain beyond their reach. Abbott further hinted at possible felony charges for fundraising to pay fines, claiming this might amount to bribery somehow, despite unclear legal footing. So, yeah, they're going hard against the Democrats for making this move here. Legal scholars say Abbott's threats are likely symbolic. The state constitution allows members to deprive a chamber of quorum, so it's totally legal, at least according to the state constitution. A 2021 Texas Supreme Court ruling affirmed legislative walkouts are not illegal. They may even be compelled back in state, but removal from office or censorship has no clear precedent. The proposed map targets Democrat leaning districts in Dallas, Houston, Austin, and South Texas, potentially flipping them and netting Republicans up to 5 new U.S. House seats in the 2026 midterms. Some districts some districts would be affected in a unique way. They would even be reconfigured to increase Hispanic voters, banking on turnout in GOP leaning areas, a controversial gamble that critics say is engineered to dilute minority influence. So I'll let you decide on what exactly that means. And this isn't the first time Democrats employed quorum breaks in 2003 and again in 2021 to block redistricting or voting restriction bills. And those efforts delayed legislation but ultimately failed. The GOP passed their maps after special sessions, and critics would say these tactics highlight the state's hyperpartisan imbalance rather than heralding any lasting reform. So the the legitimacy of all of this is really in question because I mean you do have elements of state repression, but also of the state's framing of government itself. So the Democrats' walkout can be seen as a form of civil disobedience within institutional boundaries, refusing to legitimize a process weaponized to entrench one party rule. But at the same time, it ends up looking like a clown show, right? The whole thing it's sort of a mocker. I mean, the all of the scenario, the way in which voters are potentially um, being rigged, with the gerrymandering, but you also have the walkout itself. I mean, even if you're like me and you support the walkout, it does make it all look like some sort of a joke. So the rhetoric by Abbott about desertion and dereliction of duty assumes the state has sole authority over legitimate representation, and there's the question of autonomous democratic agency, unconstrained by the whole electoral spectacle as well. You have that classic issue that kind of pops up when you get these sorts of events. Like how about people just get in there and do their jobs and actually help citizens? It's something that Republicans don't do. They get in there to actually harm citizens overall by cutting off access to resources and diverting resources more into the hands of corporations and the already rich. And by creating this sort of reaction, you might say it also makes the process, it makes people potentially want to just give up and just not participate in it because of the electoral spectacle aspect of it. So that's another part of the problem. It's really going to lead to a situation where people are going to be forced to I guess take matters into their own hands and sort of do some spontaneous organizing as a form of self help when the government isn't helping people out and, in fact, is actually putting up more hurdles in their way. So you've got threats of arrest, removal, and fines that reflect the coercive power of state structures. In this case, it's the Texas government, used to punish refusal rather than remedy underlying democratic alienation or gerrymandering. That's more specifically the problem here. So, historical redistricting in Texas has repeatedly relied on legal structural manipulation. So, from 2003 through 2021 and now 2025, it's exposed the fragility of the electoral systems against partisanship. And I would argue true democratic legitimacy cannot depend on state drawn lines or court sanctioned representational boundaries, but on the actual democratic participation and the production of policies that actually help the population more than they harm the population. And as I've said before, I've got three main points about what makes something legitimate. One is that the organization in question does what it says it does. Two is that it does more good than harm. And three is that there are ways to hold it accountable for wrongdoing. So those are the three, in my view, ways that you can tell if an organization is legitimate or not. So if Texas, if their government doesn't meet those criteria, if it's not actually doing what it says it's supposed to do, if it's not actually helping people or creating an orderly and just society and all that kind of stuff, well, then it's failing to be legitimate. And of course, the second criteria is simply that it does more good than harm. So if you look at a lot of the policies going on around the country, it's just inflicting cruelty upon people in a lot of cases, stripping them of resources and all that kind of stuff. So it's looking like the government of Texas is trying to delegitimize itself in the eyes of people out there, and including my eyes, of course. So the walkout is not merely a partisan stunt, it's a defensive tactic by delegates to preserve minority communities' power, but seen through a more radical lens, it also kind of underlines how electoral politics confers legitimacy on the very mechanisms that suppress bottom up self organization. And, if you really want to look at what happened, you had over 50 Texas House Democrats who fled the state in early August 2025 to deny quorum and block a GOP redistricting plan supported by Trump and Abbott. And Abbott's response was an ultimatum to return by August 4th or face removal proceedings, civil arrest warrants, and fines. And you also have the legal feasibility question. Experts consider Abbott's threats legally uncertain, breaking quorum isn't prohibited, and removal from office lacks precedent. So he's kind of making the law up as he goes along. So you really have to say that he is not pursuing a legitimate course of action here. And the context is that you've got mid-decade redistricting that aims to flip 5 congressional seats. And this dissent recalls past quorum breaks in 2003 and 2021. And again, the more radical view is that their action challenges state-sanctioned power grabs and really highlights the limits of institutional democracy relying on coercive authority. So you have to wonder how that's going to turn out, because some people, they only view government as something to coerce people, not to help people, but to like bully them around. Like that's like the GOP point of view of what government is. It doesn't help people, it's there to hurt people. And really what we're seeing right now is the pushback against that coercive authority and demands that our institutions actually do more to help people who need help. And let's face it, even some people who don't need help should probably still get help anyway, because the resources are there. And the fact is that our government is already helping the ultra rich as it is. So it's already helping people who don't already need help. So why not help, those lower on the economic, I guess, ladder, if you will, the ones on the lower rungs of the economic ladder. Even if they might not technically need all the help in the world, they should get a little bit of help anyway. All right, so that's the end of that little section. So now I'm going to be moving on to what I call the peripheral poop head of the week, and that is George W. Bush. And he actually played a role in Greg Abbott's rise and his judicial role. So Greg Abbott, now known for wielding expansive executive power as governor of Texas, began his notable legal career rooted in the judiciary. So, yes, even though he makes the law up as he goes along, he does have a history as a judge. He was appointed to the Texas Supreme Court in 1995 by Governor George W. Bush. And he was a state trial judge in Houston originally. And he then won elections in 1996 and 1998 to retain his seat, ultimately resigning in 2001. But Abbott's tenure on the bench gave him a platform that later helped launch one of the longest serving terms as state attorney general, from late 2002 until 2015. So George W. Bush went from oil man to Texas governor. He was born on July 6, 1946. He's the eldest son of President George H.W. Bush, served as the 46th governor of Texas from January 17th, 1995 to December 21st, 2000, before becoming president, and he somehow won 2 terms, serving from 2001 to 2009. And he was, of course, pretty infamous for his Bushisms, where he would say stupid stuff all the time. Now, I'm not going to get into that so much, but definitely you can find some compelling compilations of his Bushisms. I used to have a whole calendar, 365 days of Bushisms that I would go through, as the year went by. And there were some real doozies. You should really check some of those out to see what kind of people we sometimes put into power. And he was, of course, the most powerful person in the land, kind of. Theoretically, the president is. And, well, let's look back in his 20s. Bush flew with the Texas Air National Guard. After earning an MBA from Harvard in 1975, he entered the oil industry and even co-owned the Texas Rangers baseball team before running successfully for governor in 1994. So yeah, he was a Texas oil man and the son of a president. So I mean, you got to note the privilege that he had. We keep on electing these people who had already successful parents, and then we for some reason expect them to have our best interests in mind at all times. No, it's not. It's not like George W. Bush only did bad things. I'm gonna get into a few of the relatively positive things that he did too. So just so you know, I'm not gonna solely look at negative things here. But in Austin, Bush pushed a mix of tort reform, education funding increases, which probably were good, and he had some he championed renewable energy, which, hey, that was probably a good thing, right? And in 1999, he signed one of the nation's first renewable portfolio standards, obligating electricity retailers to source a portion of power from renewables, which actually helped Texas become the US's leading wind power producer. So, you know how Donald Trump has this hatred of wind power and windmills. So he might be George W. Bush's nemesis based on that. But, he also oversaw 152 executions, more than any previous modern governor, which of course drew criticism from clemency advocates and just people who don't like the death penalty, you know, people who find it cruel and inhumane and all that kind of stuff. And that's not as dark as his record gets. Of course, it does get worse in some ways, and I'm gonna get into that as well. And he went from Texas to the White House. Bush's policy portfolio as governor became the framework for his presidential platform. He narrowly won the 2000 election, losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College after a contentious Florida recount ended with a U.S. Supreme Court decision blocking further recounts. And also, look into the Brooks Brothers riot that I mentioned in a previous episode that was orchestrated at least partly by Roger Stone. You can look into how that a literal like rich boy riot actually interfered with the election process, and that's a fascinating thing that largely is overlooked. And people should really pay attention to these sorts of things and the implications they may have for the future. Anyway, he was reelected in 2004. He defeated John Kerry while his, you know, presidency was still becoming more authoritarian. And in the second time, he apparently earned the popular vote as well. And that's really sad. It might be a sort of testament to how boring John Kerry was as a candidate. It was, listening to him talk was just, I don't know, man. He could put anybody to sleep. He was a very good sleep aid. I'll just put it like that. And the Democrats have this fascinating habit of putting the most boring people into the nomination for president. Now, no, they don't do that every time. Like Kamala Harris, she could actually work up a crowd, and to some degree, I guess you could say Hillary Clinton wasn't as bad, but like Joe Biden, I mean, the Sleepy Joe thing, there was truth to that. I mean, let's be real. Don't get me wrong, Joe Biden did win in 2020 and all that, but nevertheless, it was despite him being the main person running. It was people voting against Trump more than voting for Biden, at least in my opinion. And, you know, Bush's first term saw passage of large tax cuts. Why does that sound so familiar? And the No Child Left Behind Act, a federal education reform aligned with conservative priorities, you might say, or far right priorities. He pursued social conservative agendas like the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act and so called faith based initiatives while launching PEPFAR in 2003 to tackle the AIDS crisis globally. And that, from what I understand, is solidly the best thing that he did as president was the AIDS program that he launched. That actually has some people saying that you know his uh his term as president was like 50-50. It was 50% good, 50% bad, or something like that. Now, I don't know if I share that view. I definitely think that George W. Bush did things that should have earned him a prison term. But I will agree that the AIDS thing, that initiative was actually pretty good from what I understand. If you have some criticism of it, go ahead and let me know what sort of scandals were involved in that program. But as far as I know, it was a solid thing. But anyway, the administration's direction was sharply redirected by the September 11, 2001 terror attacks, which triggered the War on Terror, creation of the Department of Homeland Security, enactment of the Patriot Act, which thankfully had parts of it challenged successfully in the courts. And of course, there were military invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the latter premised on the discredited claims of WMDs and ties to Al Qaeda by Iraq's President Saddam Hussein. Well, he wasn't, he was a dictator, Saddam Hussein, but he was originally supported by the United States. That's something that a lot of people don't mention. And also, the United States supported him even after some of his worst atrocities, like the Anfal campaign against the Kurds. And actually, fun fact, the U.S. support for Saddam Hussein actually goes all the way back to the Kennedy administration, where they supported the Ba'ath Party that Saddam Hussein was a big part of. And I could get into the Iraq War. I mean, you've got the Abu Ghraib scandal, which I think really kind of demonstrated how Bush was a proto Trump, as does the lying about WMDs. That was like the original big lie, the claim that Saddam Hussein had WMDs. And also, I mean, I just need to say it, the idea that the United States can sort of finger wag at any other country for having nuclear weapons or any other type of weapon is absurd, because the United States is the only country in the world that ever attacked another country with nuclear weapons. So we're quite literally the last place on earth to judge others for serving as some sort of nuclear threat or as some other type of military threat, frankly, because we're really the country that's doing more to invade other countries and support dictatorships and back terrorist groups and, all sorts of human rights abuses. And that's in addition to the stuff that we're doing directly that is actually pretty awful. Like, well, it might be characterized as indirect, but when we're arming a genocide, that's, I would say that's not particularly indirect. It's actually pretty direct. If it's indirect at all, it's just barely. I would say that it's a thing where we're very much complicit in, and the United States government, it should be held accountable for that. Our leaders should be facing serious repercussions in the International Criminal Court, and hopefully that could happen. I'm a little bit skeptical that it will, but it would be nice. Anyway, back to Bush. He also signed the Medicare Modernization Act, introducing Medicare Part D, and I think that could also be another positive aspect of, his time as president. I don't know that much about Medicare Part D because I'm not really an expert on Medicare, but as far as I know, it was a good expansion pack, you might say. And a lot about the Bush era has to do with power, state, and control. The fact that Greg Abbott had a emergence under Bush really shows you how conservative power structures are consolidated through institution stacking. His subsequent use of the Attorney General's office to challenge federal policies, suing the Obama administration dozens of times, and later the governor's sustained control over judicial appointments shows intentional centralization of authority. Bush's governorship, while superficially progressive on wind power, validated market mechanisms that privileged corporate capital and fossil fuel interests, and the deregulated grid favored cheapest production, not community or worker control, leaving grassroots energy sovereignty undeveloped. The fact is that it was actually yet another thing about uh, giving money to corporations, right? And executive practices and criminal justice reforms. They show that state violence remains central to mass control. Abbott and Bush both backed policies tightening punishment, bolstering the carceral state while framing it under public safety. On the national stage, Bush's invasions and surveillance apparatuses, the Patriot Act and Homeland Security, as it's called, they dramatically expanded state coercion, and these represent overreach justified by authorizations of fear and dumb nationalism, I would call it. And if you look at Abbott, after early judicial experience and appointment by Bush in 1995, he rose to serve as Attorney General from 2002 to 2015. His trajectory shows how legal institutions can be harnessed to reinforce right wing executive dominance. I was blending the word executive and dominance, I guess. Sorry about that. But anyway, Bush, his rise from oil executive and Texas Air Guard pilot to governor and then U.S. president, rests on a platform blending neoliberal economics, punitive justice, so called justice, energy markets, and wartime expansionism. So, kind of, that's kind of like the stereotypical uh, rich boy with a lot of power. He had a privileged upbringing, and like I said, he actually did a few good things, you know, but he should probably still be in prison. That's how it goes sometimes. And The legacy of both Bush and Abbott, they show that you got the intertwined growth of state power, militarism, and capitalism, reinforced by courtroom and executive maneuvers that shut down dissent and alternative systems. So, the Republican Party likes to claim that it's all about freedom, but they really want to shut down alternatives to the system that we actually have. They're actually pro big government, just big government for the rich and also for theocratic lunatics. All right, so moving on to the third segment here, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, which is actually Al Gore. And you might be surprised by that, but I've got some critiques of him as well. Let me get a drink of water first. Anyway, the biggest scandal involving Al Gore was arguably the 1996 campaign finance controversy, often called the Chinagate scandal. So, what was that all about? In 1996, the campaign finance controversy happened while Al Gore was serving as vice president under Bill Clinton. Gore was accused of participating in illegal fundraising activities for the 1996 re-election campaign. Gore made fundraising calls from the White House, which was a potential violation of the Hatch Act, a law meant to prevent government resources from being used for political campaigns. Now, let's be real here. Trump has violated the Hatch Act more times than a person could probably count. But nevertheless, Al Gore and people like this kind of, they kind of set the stage for the normalization of things like this. Even though few, if any, people would see Al Gore as like a super criminal or whatever, or as the most corrupt politician of all time. Nevertheless, we've had things like this be normalized. And the Democratic National Committee received donations from foreign nationals, especially Chinese sources, which was illegal under U.S. law. Now, of course, you've got Trump, you know, kind of doing way more than just receiving donations from foreign nationals. I mean, it's not just money; it's he's receiving jet planes from Qatar or Qatar, as some people pronounce it. It's just the most obvious type of corruption on the face of the earth. Um, it's an obvious bribe. That you could not make it more obvious than that. And then there's also a Buddhist temple fundraiser. Gore attended a controversial event at a Buddhist temple in California where illegal donations were allegedly funneled to the DNC. Gore claimed ignorance of the legal technicalities, citing his fundraising efforts as community outreach. So, you've got power, corruption, and the illusion of legitimacy. And from a radical lens, one which critiques power, although I don't know what makes that so radical, but if you generally reject hierarchical authority, state coercion, and capitalist structures, you would say this scandal is not about a bad actor breaking the rules. It's more about the rules themselves being part of a corrupt system. And you might say that all power centralizes and corrupts. Whether it's legal or illegal, the state's relationship to capital is fundamentally corrupt. The fact that political access can be bought by foreign or corporate donors proves that representative democracy is a facade for elite control. The state serves capital, not people. And Gore's scandal was not a glitch, it's how the system works. Fundraising from wealthy or foreign interests reflects the state's real constituency, capital, not citizens. And legalism is a distraction. The outrage focused on whether calls were made from a White House phone or whether foreign money was used. Why does it matter where the money came from if the whole system is a pay to play racket? So they might say that reform is a dead end in this type of scenario. The scandal led to investigations and hand wringing, but no fundamental change. Accountability is largely a myth under state capitalism. The system protects itself, and it will way more often prioritize punishing those at the bottom rung of the economic ladder. You know, you know, it'll do the trickle down thing, which might just be urine trickling down upon them. And from a mainstream view, Al Gore's scandal was a technical lapse in campaign finance rules. It was yet another example of how power corrupts by design and how legal channels only serve to preserve the illusion of fairness in a rigged political economy. That I suppose that's not quite the mainstream view, that last thing I said, but it's kind of becoming more mainstream. People are becoming more cynical. So it's like the mainstream view and the radical view are sort of intermingling there, because reality itself is forcing people to finally see what's going on. So the problem wasn't just Gore, it's the system he represents and the corrupt ways in which people do things under this laughably and cartoonish, nonsensical system. All right. Well, have a good day. That is the conclusion of the episode.